I'd like to welcome Connor Kavanaugh with us again today. Connor was a guest under the generational series that we did as a millennial, but today he's coming back to speak specifically about programs that help special needs trust and helps individuals that have disabilities. And so I think it's very important to understand those programs and how they work, because we're seeing more and more families having to do planning, long-range planning for their family members on how to navigate the system if something were to happen to them, and they want to make sure that the disabled child is really well taken care of through the process. So, Connor, thank you again for coming on our show. Appreciate that. And first of all, tell me a little bit about your background in working with a disability community, and especially the two programs we're going to talk about today, which is A.B.L.E accounts and Special Needs Trust.
Yeah, well, what was it? About 10 years ago, I started Palladio Consulting, a planning firm that works exclusively in the disability community. And I tell the story, Gary, by saying that it was started, 95% luck and 5% kind of conscious thought, where the 95% was I went to a training in San Diego. I was I was 3 months out of college, and I was just thirsty to learn more information. Well, I go to a training in San Diego, and it was all on special needs planning, and I leave that saying, there's a huge need that nobody knows a lot about. Let's explore a bit further. The 5% conscious thought was, hey, we have 19% of the U.S. population, according to the 2010 census. 19% of the U.S. population has a disability,
Right.
Whether it's, intellectual disability, a physical disability, a learning disability. And so it's a large subsection of the population that there's just not a lot of resources out there, and especially on kind of navigating the ins and outs of it. So like you mentioned, we'll talk about A.B.L.E and we'll talk about Special Needs Trust, but that's the landscape of it. And that's kind of how we came to be, and I came to be. So most people think I came to the disability community because I have a son or daughter or brother or sister, or some type of personal experience in the disability community, which is actually not the case, though.
Right.
I say, yeah.
You're way too young, but I can actually remember when they started Special Needs Trust back 20 years ago or so.
Yeah.
And actually, my fiduciary agency with our attorney was one of the first ones to request a Special Needs Trust be set up under a conservatorship because of the new law. And of course, the A.B.L.E accounts have been just recently brought on board as well. But we are seeing more and more need for the services that you're providing on setting these up, helping us manage the investments, and to make sure that we're not violating any of the provisions within the Special Needs Trust statutes or A.B.L.E account status. So A.B.L.E accounts, I wish I could remember what it stands for, but I don't.
That's all right. Yeah.
What is an A.B.L.E account?
Yeah. So, A.B.L.E is one of their fancy acronyms, Achieving a Better Life Experience. And to set the stage, there's of that 19% of the population with a disability, many of those individuals are receiving needs-based government benefits. And to be eligible, for the needs-based government benefits like SSI or Medicaid, you have to be under $2,000 in assets. And so since those programs launched, in the 60s, you'd say, gosh, well, for the last, 60 years, individuals had to live in poverty to essentially qualify for those important supports. Well, back in 2014, President Obama signed into federal law the A.B.L.E Act, which allows an individual with a disability who's receiving those important government benefits to have an A.B.L.E account that's in their name that's not countable towards that $2,000 asset limit. So nowadays, somebody could have $35,000 in an A.B.L.E account and be receiving their $841 a month SSI check and be receiving important Medicaid supports, but yet save money into that account and have it accumulate, and they can use that for in assistive technology or a vacation or tickets to the Mariners playoff baseball game. And so all these really cool, life experience things that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to do because of that $2,000 asset limit. So Gary, it's really, game changing, and in many instances, life changing
Sure.
law. And so it's been around, for federally since 2014, Oregon 2016, Washington 2019, I believe, but they're incredibly impactful. So
Great. Part of the thing on the A.B.L.E account, if I'm correct on it, is that there's no restrictions about how the money is spent. You can do it on food, housing, anything, which is not true of a special needs trust. And we'll talk about that a little earlier. Is that the indication that you're seeing, is that it can be used for all of those purposes?
yeah, one of the things in which Congress wanted, and I think advocates wanted when the A.B.L.E Act was actually going through the whole legislative process, was they wanted this to be an empowerment tool. They wanted the money to be able to be flexible. And it definitely is. We use the term, hey, the money can be used anything for the sole benefit of the individual.
Great.
So, yeah.
We've actually used it in conjunction with the Special Needs Trust, especially for real estate owned by the Special Needs Trust, because taxes are considered housing, real property taxes. So we've had, in conjunction, an A.B.L.E account in order to pay those taxes without any repercussions at all to the beneficiary of the Special Needs Trust, and some of those things. So that's been a big lifesaver for some of our clients.
Yeah.
Because we used to have to pay it, then take the third deduction and for a month and do all the guidelines for Medicaid on that.
Yep.
So how would one, there's several states that offer A.B.L.E accounts out there. And let's talk a little bit about how you might select one other than the state you're living in for the A.B.L.E account administration.
Yeah. So I believe the tally is up to 46 of the 50 states have an A.B.L.E account, and most of them are open to individuals who do not reside in that state.
Mm-hmm.
How we think about, what A.B.L.E account might somebody use. Many of the A.B.L.E accounts, for the most part, as you look at high level, are very similar. What the money can be used for, how much can you contribute to the A.B.L.E account, things like that. Where some of the A.B.L.E accounts are different because the A.B.L.E Act is federal law, but each and every state had to opt in and establish their own state A.B.L.E plan. And so some of the states, have things like, I believe Ohio has 9 different investment options. Oregon and Washington have 3. The Massachusetts plan is run by, I believe it's American Funds. The Oregon and Washington plan is run by Vanguard. That's who the I shouldn't use the term run by. The investment options are Vanguard. So there's some of those small differences. A really good resource is ABLENRC.org, which A.B.L.E NRC is National Resource Center, and there is a tool on that website that allows somebody to compare and contrast 3 different plans at once. You select 3 different plans, it gives you this really helpful spreadsheet that you can compare, fees and investment options and those types of things. So many families, especially in Oregon, for example, use their state plan because Oregon's plan specifically has a $300 tax credit that's available. So there's small things like that might be beneficial, but most of them across the board fairly similar. But the A.B.L.E National Resource Center is a great resource to compare and contrast.
And let's talk a little bit about the criteria for the individual being able to have an A.B.L.E account, and then the criteria for how much contribution you can make per year, and all those what I call constraints to some extent for those programs.
Yeah. So to qualify for the A.B.L.E account, the current legislation is an individual has to have a qualifying disability that occurred prior to age 26 to establish the A.B.L.E account. So, Down syndrome diagnosis at birth, autism at 3 or 5 or 8, absolutely. If the medical diagnosis happened before 26, you're eligible for the A.B.L.E account. Um, um, there's pending legislation to potentially increase that to age 46, which would be fantastic. But at this point, we're still, hanging on. The people and the kind of the disability subgroups that get left out are veterans coming back from serving our country overseas. Somebody has a traumatic brain injury after age 26. Those are the individuals experiencing disability now that don't fall under the current or aren't eligible for the current A.B.L.E plan. So we're optimistic that advocates and policymakers have it on their agenda because they see how impactful the A.B.L.E account has been for the, for the individuals that currently have them. The ability to save money for a future expense is an important, just general financial planning concept, and becomes much more important, especially for individuals with disabilities who may have expenses come up that aren't, foreseen. So.
Absolutely. We've had a challenge as well, meeting the 26 age limit here, where we have people that we can't go back and actually document, even though we probably know the disability occurred prior to age 26, but we just can't document it. So thus we can't take advantage of the A.B.L.E account. One of the things you mentioned that I think is important is disabilities at birth are genetic. We had a client that has Huntington disease, which is genetic. We were able to get them an A.B.L.E account because it's genetic, and we said that occurs at birth. So I think there are some ways to kind of finesse that where you would be able to have an A.B.L.E account, where at first glance you wouldn't be able to.
Yeah.
So the A.B.L.E accounts you can contribute up to $10,000 per year. Is that correct?
It's actually up to 16,000 now.
Okay.
16,000 on an annual basis. Yeah.
Huh?
And the other cool thing, so any individual, regardless of age, $16,000 a year can go into their A.B.L.E account. Doesn't matter if it's coming from one person, being their mom or dad or grandma, or 16 people, $16,000 a year for everybody. Now,
Right.
in 2017, there was a law that passed that it's the able to work contribution amount that's an additional $12,880 for an individual that's employed.
Right.
So you could have somebody who's, earning I don't know, $15,000 a year, working at Safeway, and they could put in an additional $12,880 for darn near almost $30,000 a year contributions to an A.B.L.E account. So really, really cool. Gosh, when you think about the premise behind needs-based benefits, that goes against everything that needs-based benefits like Social Security and Medicaid were set up to do. And so it's really cool just to see Congress get on board and policymakers get on board with allowing these types of contribution amounts to these types of A.B.L.E accounts. So.
And is there a limit at how much dollars can be in the A.B.L.E account?
So gets a little bit complicated, but if an individual is on SSI and they're receiving the $841 a month needs-based Social Security benefit, the most they can have in an A.B.L.E account while still being eligible for that SSI check is $100,000.
Okay.
For an individual that's on an SSDI benefit, or a Social Security benefit that could be based on their work record or a parent's work record, at that point, if they're only on that benefit, they can have up to the state maximum, which Oregon and Washington, well, Oregon, for example, is 400,000. Let's take Ohio, for example, they're 525,000. So long story short, if you're on SSI, you want to keep your A.B.L.E account under 100,000. If you're on SSDI, you can have up to what tends to be in the 400s to 500,000, depending on the state. So
that's a great tool to be utilized. Are you seeing individuals that have children that have disabilities early in life, like at 3 or 4, going ahead and setting up an A.B.L.E account and contributing to that account prior to them reaching 18?
Yeah, it's what we've seen is it was common practice, 5 or 10 years ago that a grandparent says, well, gosh, I'd love to save for my grandchild. I'm going to set up a college 529 for him.
Hmm.
And so we see all these college accounts being set up for, a grandchild or a child, and the custodian or the person that oversees it, is grandpa or grandma or mom or dad. Well, now with the A.B.L.E account being as flexible as it is, being able to be used for college, but yet every other expense for an individual, many grandparents or parents are setting up A.B.L.E accounts and using it in the same way of saying, hey, we have a 9-month-old. We'd like to start putting $50 a month away for their future. We know they have a diagnosis and a disability. Let's set up an A.B.L.E account instead of a college 529. And so, yeah, we see a lot of families, I think, beginning to be more proactive on the planning side, because most families realize that government benefits don't cover everything and
Right.
won't cover everything, for the life of their child. And so they want to be proactive by, saving. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So when we talk about setting it up, how's the process for that? And is it easy? Is it difficult? Or how does that process work?
Yep. So, um, you can only set up the A.B.L.E account in most states. In Oregon and Washington, for example, to speak to them, you can only set up a Oregon or Washington A.B.L.E account directly through both Oregon and Washington's A.B.L.E websites.
Okay.
So there's a specific website for each and every state that most states you have to go directly to their website to establish the account. There is a paper application, but most people do the online application. It's easy, it's straightforward.
Sure.
Um, you can't open an A.B.L.E account if you go down to your local bank. They're going to look at you like you're speaking a different language. Most financial planners and advisors are going to say the same thing, or going to give you the same reaction, because they cannot establish an A.B.L.E account, because it is state administered, which the Oregon and the Washington A.B.L.E websites, easy, intuitive. It takes probably 20 minutes to get it set up. So that's, I think, what confuses many families is, like an investment account, you can go to, Vanguard.com,
Sure.
and, this is a little bit different. It's got to be on the state A.B.L.E website.
Okay. And so if the person wants to make a distribution out of an A.B.L.E account, so for example, they want to spend $2,000 on a vacation for the beneficiary, how does that work and the process for that?
Yep. So the good thing about A.B.L.E accounts is there's no pre-approval for a distribution. There's no submitting of what the money is going to be used for to get pre-approved before you take the money out. It's all self-certifying. So a parent, say they set the A.B.L.E account on behalf of their child, the parent is self-certifying, under penalty of perjury, that the account is being used for what it should be, the sole benefit of their child. And so they can take money out as if it's just any old investment account or a checking account. We do recommend families who are taking money out of the A.B.L.E account a couple distributions a month, let's say, to keep track of what it's being used for in the event of some type of audit.
Right.
The other thing that's really cool about many A.B.L.E plans across the country is there's a prepaid debit card that
Mhm.
you can set up, that a parent can, or a grandparent or whoever can load money onto that prepaid debit card. They can send that card, with their child, and a support worker who are going to a Mariners baseball game, and they can use that prepaid debit card to buy a hot dog and a Coke and tickets and a hat. And
Yeah.
so, really easy, in terms of, taking money out. So.
Yeah, the prepaid debit card been a great tool for individuals under, conservatorship, under with special needs trust, and all of those sort of things that we can actually restrict where they spend the money to make sure that we're in compliance. But that's been a great tool to do, and I'm glad we're moving forward into that. So if I make a request today for funds to be placed on the prepaid debit card, how long does that process usually take?
We're seeing that usually take a couple business
These
days.
days? Okay.
I think the states are working extremely hard on the processing and the administration of the A.B.L.E accounts really across the country, but they are all new. And so they're trying to work out some of these kinks on transfer
Right.
times of moving money. But for the most part, a couple business days, tends to be what we typically see, and um, usually doesn't impact adversely the individual, but
Right. So we talked a little bit about how some of the investments are handled through Vanguard or handled through somebody else. So again, I think our listeners need to realize that it is an investment tool and may go up and may go down. So you might have less than 16,000 in there due to the investment model. Um, how do you? I know that people come to you for advice on how to invest because that's your expertise. So, what should a parent or grandparent look at when setting these accounts as far as the investment goals and investment
yeah.
instruments?
So every A.B.L.E account has a cash option as well as, a variety of different investment
Mhm.
options. Let's take Oregon and Washington, for example, because they're almost identical A.B.L.E plans. They have three different investment options through Vanguard: conservative allocation, a moderate allocation, and an aggressive allocation.
Mhm.
Um, they're all low cost Vanguard funds and well performing and built of many different underlying funds, so diversified. In terms of how we help families think through how should they allocate the $10,000 contribution they make to an A.B.L.E account, the first thing I think of is, when is that individual going to need that money? Is it going to be in 6 months? Is it going to be in 6 years? Is it going to be in 16 years? Because generally speaking, the longer the time horizon, the more time you have to
Right.
let the account do its ebb and flow, the ups and the downs. We've seen the market do it, for 100 years now.
Right.
And so the longer time horizon you have to needing the money, well, you can withstand some of those short-term storms that the market goes through, because you know that over time the market generally rises. If you need it in 6 months to pay for, tuition or room and board, at a supported living arrangement, well, we want to make sure that that's kept in cash, that's secure, and so we tend to lean more towards, hey, the FDIC insured, investment cash option through the A.B.L.E account or the
Right.
conservative fund. So um, whatever the goal in mind and whenever the duration of when that money is needed, helps us really dictate how to invest it. And that's why I think in all forms of special needs planning, thinking about the vision for the individual and what does life look like for them, and
Mhm.
what benefits are they receiving, and how much support do they need, and when you're going to need the money, all of those kind of high level planning discussions, I think, are important to build a good solid foundation.
And oversight of the investments by the states, is it done similar to like they would do their PERS programs, or how is that oversight done?
Yeah, similar to how they would do their college 529,
Okay.
Yeah, and similar to PERS. I mean, I believe it's the Treasury Board in each and every state. They have a board that their job is to keep tabs on the A.B.L.E account, and if they think that the investment options are underperforming, then I'm sure they have the ability to make changes. The other thing I'd say is, Vanguard, or American funds, or any of the institutions that manage the underlying investments for A.B.L.E accounts, they're obviously working their hardest to make sure that they're, allocating
Mhm.
and adjusting and rebalancing all the A.B.L.E funds, as we go throughout the year, um, to make sure that performance is as good as it can be. The other thing I'll mention, and you may get to this, so stop me if this can be a follow-up question, but the tax benefits of A.B.L.E accounts is really helpful. And so,
Mhm.
you could rebalance an account and sell, you could put $10,000 in your A.B.L.E account, take all the money out, in 5 years after it's grown to 20,000 to purchase whatever, and none of that investment growth is taxable. And so that's where the investment management, you don't have to worry about the tax implications of selling investments at a gain. So it gives the the family or the investor, I guess, or who's ever helping the individual with their A.B.L.E account not have to worry about taxes when thinking about investment decisions. So,
and that's a great tool. And that would not have been a follow-up question because I wouldn't have realized that. But that's very, very good. So on A.B.L.E accounts, are there anything else that you think that our listeners would need to know about that before we move on to special needs trust?
I think one of the things, so the implementation rate across the country for A.B.L.E accounts has been less than I think what a lot of people were projecting.
Right.
And so I think the first reason, in my opinion, behind that has been the education on it. We're trying to do a lot more, outreach and webinars. I know each and every state A.B.L.E fund is. The second thing that I'd mentioned to families that have done of research on A.B.L.E accounts that may live California, Oregon, Washington, Florida, Texas, you name it, is in the federal A.B.L.E law and the A.B.L.E Act. What was put in the A.B.L.E Act is what's called a Medicaid payback, which says that, I know you know a ton about that, but if an individual with an A.B.L.E account has $50,000 in their A.B.L.E account, the federal law says if they pass away, Medicaid in their state can essentially recoup funds to be reimbursed for the Medicaid service they provided over the point in time in which the individual had their A.B.L.E account.
Right.
There's been 4 states that have repealed their Medicaid payback, meaning, for example, Oregon does not have a Medicaid payback. So there's really no concern at this point of funds being repaid to the state Medicaid system. But that's something that if you're looking, or if you live in another state, if you have listeners, Gary from North Carolina, they'd want to know more about how their state's going to handle, funds that are in the A.B.L.E account at the passing of an A.B.L.E account holder. So,
okay. And like Oregon, if they don't have a Medicaid payback and there's funds left into it, how are those funds dispersed upon death of the beneficiary?
So currently, A.B.L.E Oregon has it set up where you can name a beneficiary to your A.B.L.E account, but the beneficiary has to be another A.B.L.E account.
Oh, okay.
So, if an individual has a brother or sister with a disability as well, and something happens to them, they can leave their funds and goes directly to that individual's A.B.L.E account. It doesn't have to be a sibling or a family member. It could be a friend. In the event in which an individual says, or a family says, well, we just don't have somebody who has another A.B.L.E account we'd want to leave the money to. What happens if they pass away is it's a part of the individual's estate. Just as if anybody else passes away and they have assets, it goes and it's a part of their estate. And most of the time it's going to make their way back to a brother or sister or a parent. And so it's going to take a little bit longer because there's no named beneficiaries on A.B.L.E accounts like there would be on a Roth IRA or a life insurance policy. So if there's no Medicaid payback, it'd make its way back to, next of kin, family member, friend, whomever, but it might take a little bit longer.
So if there's no payback provision and it goes to the estate, Oregon is saying they're not going to come back on the estate like normal liens and recoup the money for Medicaid?
So that's been the big concern throughout the states that have repealed their Medicaid payback is Medicaid recovery. We're not sure that once the funds leave the A.B.L.E account and now as a part of their state, can Medicaid recovery in Oregon, for example, then pounce on that money now that it's no longer in the A.B.L.E account. We just haven't seen enough cases that have showed us what exactly is going to happen and how some of the states are going to react to, funds leaving an A.B.L.E account. Because here in Oregon, you could have a $400,000 A.B.L.E account that I think Medicaid would probably be pretty excited about recouping. So that's another thing about A.B.L.E accounts being fairly new is we just haven't seen, enough situations play out to get a good sense of how that's going to work.
Right.
So,
well, A.B.L.E accounts is changing, and hopefully we'll get the education out there about them. We've used them in good, like I said, in conjunction with special needs trust or conservatorships or that sort of thing to set them up. So special needs trust has been around longer than the A.B.L.E accounts. And a little more history on how those are administered and what you can do and can't do with regard to those regulations that we have to all abide by if we're a special needs trustee for our beneficiaries. But explain a little bit about we'll talk first about the first party versus third party special needs trust and what those look like and where the funds come from for special needs trust under first party and where the funds likely will come from the third party.
Yeah. Well, it was 1993. I was 5 years old when OBRA passed Omnibus Reconciliation Act, passed in 1993. So that's when it, as you previously mentioned, that's when Special Needs Trust rolled out.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I was a little older than that, 1993. But yeah.
Yep. So, well, in the last, call it 28 or so years, boy, have they become a foundational planning tool. When you think about, they kind of have the same premise as an A.B.L.E account, being you have an individual receiving needs-based benefits, and the parents say they have a house and they got a retirement account, they got life insurance, they have assets. Well, at some point, mom and dad are going to pass away. And if they have $1 million estate and a single only child that has a disability, how else do you leave that money to them? Because of that $2,000 asset limit, obviously $1 million estate going to, their 35-year-old son receiving SSI and Medicaid would jeopardize and eliminate all the benefits he or she receives. So voila, 1993 comes along. Special needs trusts are now federal law. The ability for mom and dad to say, you know what, our $1 million estate, we will not leave it to our son directly or daughter directly. We're going to draft a special needs trust in our estate planning documents and then retitle our beneficiaries in our estate planning documents to say all of those assets, that $1 million will go into, Johnny Johnson Special Needs Trust.
Right.
And it's again the single only way that you can leave money to an individual and not jeopardize their eligibility. And then obviously you got great trustees like you, Gary, that are assigned to administer those special needs trusts and make distributions on behalf of the individual to supplement what they're getting in Medicaid or wages they're receiving at work or Social Security benefits. And so it allows them the ability to keep those very important Medicaid funded Social Security supports, but yet still have access to $1 million to add quality of life, because we know life's expensive and government benefits don't cover it all.
That's correct. And just a little tidbit for you, since you were 5 in 93, the only reason why this passed Congress and was done is because some of the senators and congressmen, women, had children with disabilities, and they didn't like how, if they left it to their child, how that would really take them off all the benefits and make it very unsecure for that individual. So that's how it came about.
Wow.
So it directly affected the senators in the House of Representatives. But the thing about special needs trust is, and so if I leave my money to a special needs trust and doesn't go directly to the beneficiary, is that considered a third party trust or first party? Or let's talk a little bit about the differences between those two terms.
Yeah. So there's two different types of special needs trusts. Like you mentioned, there's the first party trust and there's a third party trust. And so what the first party refers to is if the individual with a disability has any money in their name that they then put inside of a special needs trust, that is referred to as a first party special needs trust, because the individual with the disability is that quote unquote first person.
Right.
They're commonly also referred to as Medicaid payback trusts or self-settled trusts, or even some attorneys now refer to them as D4A trusts.
Right.
All are that first party special needs trusts. On the other end of the continuum of the special needs trust landscape, you have the third party special needs trusts. And I'm not sure what happened to the second person, but they went right from first person, first party, to third party. But the third party trust is, I've heard that joke at way too many conferences, way too many times.
Well, it's a good joke, and it's actually true on that one.
Yeah.
Where is the second person?
But it's money. A third party trust is a special needs trust funded by somebody other than the individual.
Right.
Mom, dad, grandma, grandpa. So, and that's the big difference between the two, as the names illustrate, is who puts the money in.
Exactly. And the first party is, like you said, a Medicaid payback. So if the individual passes away, the money does go to Medicaid to pay back the what I'll call a lien. So if there's additional money over that lien, then that's distributed to the estate because we've paid off the Medicaid liability. The third party, you would designate beneficiaries to receive the money if that individual beneficiary passed away. So that's another difference between the two on that. You administer in the same way as far as regulations go. And I'm very surprised that the A.B.L.E account will let you pay for food and housing, but the special needs trust, on the other hand, will not. And what is defined as housing is interesting as well within the guidelines. So let's talk a little bit about what things can be paid for out of special needs trust and other areas that we can look at paying for housing, such as taxes, but there are some offsets that we can do to negate the impact.
Yeah. Well, a lot of what a trust can pay for obviously is laid out in the trust document. You know, we have families ask that same question to us, whether it's on a webinar or in a client meeting, and we always say, hey, we could tell you what we've seen special needs trust pay for, but the most important thing is make sure, go back to your trust document, take a look at it, because a well-written, special needs trust should give you some type of clarity on what the money can be used for. First party special needs trusts are very, very specific. We've had attorneys tell us, you can't really do a lot of changing and tweaks with first party trusts. Social Security and Medicaid want to see very specific language.
Right.
And that very specific language is, like you mentioned, no housing distributions, no food distributions. And that's a hard and fast rule. The third party trust, we can be an attorney. I'm not an attorney, but an attorney can be much more flexible on how they draft the language because it's not a Medicaid, payback trust. And so we've seen attorneys nowadays drafting third-party trusts to say, hey, this trust can, pay for food, it can pay for shelter, it can pay for things that may temporarily reduce or eliminate government benefits if it's in the best interest of the individual to make that happen.
Right.
I think the big concern about some of these special needs trusts that don't allow for food and shelter distributions is specifically, we see food and we see shelter being two really expensive items, and items that the cost of those items is growing up substantially. Portland, San Francisco, Seattle, Vancouver, I mean, you name it, wherever you live, your rent costs or housing costs are likely going through the roof substantially. And with Social Security, historically not keeping pace with the rising cost of housing, without a trust that can make a distribution for housing, the concern could be long-term, well, gosh, we got $1 million in a trust, but we can't pay for food and shelter expenses. Is there anything we can do? And that's where we see a lot of distributions being made from a special needs trust to an A.B.L.E account because of the flexibility of the A.B.L.E account. So I think attorneys are getting really, really good at how do we draft a trust that protects eligibility for needs-based benefits, number one, but also can meet the individual wherever they are at in life. Because again, we had a phone call with a family yesterday. They have a son with an autism diagnosis, mid-20s, extremely high functioning. In 10 years, he could be making $65,000 as an engineer, or he could be not employed, still living at home with mom and dad, no plans for being self-sufficient or self-supported, and so that's where I think the flexibility becomes important.
The flexibility is key, and what we find is if we can't qualify the individual due to the 26 or under regulation on the A.B.L.E accounts, we do have some flexibility in paying for housing. And you're right, rents are a huge amount of a disabled person's budget. And if you haven't gotten them into section housing, subsidized housing, or in other types of living arrangements, the expectation for them to pay rent out of 841 is unrealistic. And you know that, and I know that. So what we've done in the past and still do is we are able, due to the guidelines, the Social Security guidelines, we take the third reduction every month off of those benefits of 841 and pay the housing. And because that's the only way the person's going to be able to live, is by the Special Needs Trust paying that specific housing expense. We also, at times when we don't have a A.B.L.E account to pay the taxes out of or anything else, we literally, the month that the taxes are due, we declare that as a third deduction from the benefit and pay the taxes and anything else we can do for that individual annually in order to limit the ability of the beneficiary to not be that inconvenienced. And we can also make up the difference between the third distribution, the third they took, put it back into them out of the Special Needs Trust. So there are things that we can do. The food thing is interesting to me because people go out, McDonald's, all the fast food and stuff, and they're considering in that. But there's really not a guideline that I'm aware of, and I don't know whether you are, about what they consider to travel out of their area, whether that would be considered a trip or a vacation versus where they're located. Do you know anything about that one, Connor?
The specifics, no. What I've heard and seen has been, if an individual is going to the grocery store and they're gonna, they need to spend $100 on groceries, unfortunately, that's not an approved expense
Right.
under what we've seen. You bring up a good point. If they go to, I keep using the Mariners game example,
Yeah.
but if they go to a Mariners game, they buy a hot dog. Where does that fall? I don't know the specifics of that. Luckily, I think the A.B.L.E account, if you are eligible, simplifies that. So that's going to be
Exactly.
my easy way out answer to your tough question, Gary. But
Well, what we follow is that if it's something they're traveling to, we consider that to be a vacation, a trip. So the food is included as part of that, hotel rooms and all of that.
yeah,
Also, there is a little unknown fact out there that really you have up to $60 per month that you don't have to account for on food. So we lump those McDonald's, going to, buying things at the Chevron station down the street into that, and have been very successful in that. The other thing that's kind of interesting about the food versus the other one is we have clients that are in Special Needs Trust that work at a fast food restaurant. They get a discount, they eat there. And how is that reflected in the Special Needs Trust? So we've been wrestling with that. I'm not sure of the answer on that one yet, but I'm what we're doing is putting it as an employment expense. Because to me, they're eating there during their work. It's part of a benefit, so it is employment. We haven't had any issues with that, but that's been the latest one that we've come across on that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So if I want to open up, I go to my attorney and I open up a Special Needs Trust, and it's going to be either first or third party. What are some of the considerations on setting it up, as far as I know? We come to you to say, help us plan, help us do the investing of this to fit the client's needs on that one. So tell me a little bit, or relay a little bit on how that looks, Connor.
Yeah, well, so I think we get a lot of families who think that once they get a Special Needs Trust drafted, boom, they're done. They can kind of
Right.
move on to the next thing. What we always say is it's kind of like buying a car. Like, once you buy a car, you drive off the lot and you park in your garage. Well, there's going to have to be a couple things happen for that car to
Right.
actually, go to this next destination, whether it's a store or wherever. One, you got to put gas in it. And two, there's got to be someone driving it.
Right.
And I use that analogy of saying, well, the gas is like, in a special needs trust example, is the money going into the trust. So we have to think about, how are we going to fund it? What are the assets that we leave behind to the trust, whether it's now or at your passing? Life insurance, Roth IRA, brokerage account, real estate. So we got to think about how we're going to plan on funding it, the assets, the amount, how it's going to impact mom and dad's retirement, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
The other thing is, in drafting of the special needs trust, you're going to appoint a trustee. You're going to name a trustee, and that person or entity has to know about the individual with a disability and the benefits they're receiving, and kind of be up to speed on some of these things that we've just gone through for the last 50 minutes. And so all of those things are equally important as the actual document, is we want somebody who has experience in that. And then I think lastly is understanding how the special needs trust plugs into the overall support plan.
Right.
Where does the individual live? Are they employed? How do they get to their doctor's appointments? Who are their support worker? All that kind of stuff. So it's a special needs trust is a foundational piece, but there's many other things that should be built around it to make it operate effectively and to be, to best support the individual. So,
So if it's a first party, and say it's a personal injury type of settlement that has come in, and we call structured settlements in those, which means they look at cash, they look at annuities, they look at all those investments. How is that differently handled than someone opening up a third party?
Great question. So we typically see third-party trusts being drafted and funded to be, hey, it's proactive. It's mom and dad who are 50 years old. They're thinking about what happens when they're 90. They're just being more proactive and thinking 3 or 4 steps ahead. And so the need to fund it, the need for the money for the individual isn't as important, because they have mom to rely on or dad to rely on, or other supports because their parents are still here. In a first-party situation where you get a settlement from a personal injury, situation, what typically happens in those instances is you have somebody who just got in a motorcycle accident that now they need support. Their life has totally changed.
Mm-hmm.
They go from being $80,000 a year working as a general manager of a restaurant to now needing full-time care. And so when we think about how the investments or just the planning for third-party trust differs from a first party is, hey, that money is likely going to be used in the days or the weeks after the settlement, funds into the first party trust. So we don't have a 10-year time horizon. We got expenses that have to be paid ASAP. So we're being really, really, thoughtful about, we got to have some in cash. We got to have some in really conservative investments. We got to be conscious about the tax implications depending on the amount. And so, and then there's, many different family dynamics, in a first party trust situation where,
absolutely,
we could talk for hours about that, but though they're both special needs trusts, first and third party, boy, are they different just in the stage of life in which in many instances they're in. So,
and they're more different in administration side as well. The first party usually has a lot of, if it's a personal injury settlement, has a care plan or life plan that they've projected out what the individual is going to need over the life of the disability. And that is used as the basis for determining how much you put in the structured settlement. And we'll have another discussion about structured settlement at some point. But you would put in annuities, cash. What are your immediate needs looked at after you got it? Most of the first party we have, you always want to have, they're looking at purchasing a home, the trust purchasing a home, a wheelchair accessible van. So those are immediate needs that we need out of that. So as a trustee, we have to make sure that those funds are available and work with you and other individuals to ensure that we've got that pretty well covered, because if we tie it up in annuities, when we need the cash, we're up the creek without a paddle, as we say. And so we're really having to look at that. But also, I think the expectations of the beneficiary and the family members is quite different than what the expectations of the third party individual is. And a lot of times, and this is my personal slant on it, is the personal injury attorneys usually tell the beneficiary and the family things that the special needs trust can do that is not correct. And so they're sitting there going, oh, they said we could do that. Well, no, you can't do that. We cannot do that. So I think that's one of the key things about working with that. So the special needs trust arena might be a better tool if you're looking at a third party for A.B.L.E account. It's still an A.B.L.E account after you get up to a certain limit if there's a payback. Would that be a fair assumption on my part?
Yeah, I would say in many instances, most families that we work with, there is an A.B.L.E account and a special needs trust as part of the overall plan. They're both important and impactful, just do different things. And what we generally tell families is, hey, think of that third party special needs trust that you're drafting to for the ability to leave money behind your child without impacting their eligibility. That's a longer term tool. You likely won't fund it maybe for next couple of years or a decade.
Right.
And so it's, again, long term, it's that wealth transfer vehicle, essentially. The A.B.L.E account is great for birthday money. It's great for Christmas money. It's dollars they get from employment. You want to save systematically every month into something that's really flexible. That is an A.B.L.E account, and that's where we generally see it fitting in. So both important, both impactful, just different.
Exactly. We've been talking about standalone special needs trust. Is a vehicle called pooled trust, which each state may have one, administered by a nonprofit within their state. And so that is an option that I think can be looked at for individuals with lesser amounts of money. We usually say at least 100,000 or less goes into that type of program. But any ideas or words on that? Are you familiar with how those are set up and what they look like?
Yeah, I think those are really important. I think pooled trusts have a very important piece kind of just in the overall landscape of special needs planning, because, like you mentioned, not everybody has $1 million estate. There's families that have, 6 kids and they want their estate to be distributed evenly, and maybe it's only going to be 85,000 left,
right,
to a child, or maybe it's not $1 million settlement from a motorcycle accident, but maybe the individual is 16, they get, hit on their bike and it's a $16,000 settlement or a $26,000 settlement. Those pooled trusts become really impactful and important in that situation. So we see those become more and more important, depending on the situation. I think the other big benefit is many families turn to us and they say, hey, Connor, we don't know who we're going to name as trustee when we're no longer here. Well, the benefit of, using one of those pooled trusts is that entity, they have the ability to serve as trustee.
Right.
They do all the tax prep. They do the distributions. And obviously, tons about that because you guys are such an important, player in that arena. But so, yeah.
Well, I think one of the benefits of the pooled trust on the smaller ones is we've already had the joiner agreement and other agreements reviewed and blessed by attorneys, but they're also blessed by Department of Human Services in both Oregon and Washington. We have first and third party are blessed in those states. So you don't have to worry about maybe not having a pooled trust that qualifies within those two states. So I think that's important. So there's no legal cost onto it. And usually they're coming in at flat fees on what they're doing. And then the investments are pooled together under an investment plan that allows them to receive more investment type of benefits because it's a larger pool of monies going into it. But those are some of the benefits of that happening. and really good way of working with it. There's been a couple of ripplings in that market recently. One is out of the South, where a nonprofit trust, pooled trust, was taking profit and putting it into a for-profit agency or for-profit. And so the OCC has said you cannot do that. It needs to stay within the nonprofit in order to make that happen. And so now we'll start regulating those larger pooled trusts. So I would just caution the listeners to really do your research and find out how long they've been around, what happens if they make a profit, where does it go? I think is the key questions to ask on that.
Yeah.
And in our Washington Pooled Trust, on the first party, if the individual passes away, half of the money goes back to the Medicaid lien per our agreement with them, and 50% stay in the trust and is divided among the beneficiaries in the trust. So you're able to get more money to do that. Oregon, of course, wouldn't allow it, but Washington did.
That's great. That's a huge benefit. Cool.
It is. And we've actually had a fairly large one pass away, and that really did benefit the clients within the pooled trust by about $5,000 or $8,000 each within their additional funds. Yeah. Wow. So special needs trust. I think I would ask that we come back together at some point, talk specifically about special needs trust, because you are the expert in that and who we turn to when we need to know that, know anything about the investment side or how to set them up, as well as the government benefits. You guys are awesome about helping individuals out with that, to do that. But is there anything else you want to add about special needs trust?
No, I think we touched on a lot of the important things. I guess the only parting words I would have is begin as a family, begin thinking about the planning now, where we see a lot of families, they come to us when, they're in their early 70s and their son or daughter's 40, but if your child just received a diagnosis, whether they're, 3 or 8 or 10 years old, start thinking about these things now, because it gives you such a long timeline to really start putting all these different things in place. So that would be
it's very advice. True. And there's some additional ways in which we can take and create a special needs trust if one hasn't been established before. So that'll be something I'm talking about. Also, there is an administration hand guide that I have on my website, produced, that really goes into detail about what first and third party are, talks about, what we can pay for and how we do it. It goes about the third reduction. So we'll post that on our website. Post it with this podcast and allow people to go in and look at it. It's a very good tool. It's done by an association out of California, but we utilize it all the time.
That's great. Yeah.
Connor, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. The A.B.L.E account and Special Needs Trust. It's always been a pleasure. And take care.
Thank you, Gary. Thanks for having me, and always good chat with you.
Great.